What happens when the city's most feared crime lord is humiliated by his own syndicate and forced to marry a plus-size maid? They thought they were breaking his pride. They didn't know they were handing him the one woman he had spent the last 15 years tearing the world apart to find. The air in the underground boardroom of the Castellano syndicate was thick with the stench of expensive cigars and cheap betrayals. Dominic Castellano sat at the head of the mahogany table, his tailored Armani suit barely containing the lethal coiled energy of a predator. At 32, he was the undisputed boss of the Chicago underworld, a title he had carved out of bone and blood. Yet, the old blood, the Syndicate Council, despised his modern methods. Leading the dissent was his uncle, Vincent Castellano. Vincent had orchestrated a masterful, disgusting trap. Invoking an archaic, centuries-old family law, the council declared that a boss without a wife by his 33rd birthday was unfit to rule. But it wasn't just a marriage they demanded, it was a marriage of their choosing. They wanted to strip Dominic of his untouchable aura, to turn him into a walking punchline. "The terms are set, Dominic," Vincent sneered, tossing a glossy manila folder onto the polished wood. "You sign the loyalty pact and marry the woman the council has selected, or you forfeit your seat at the head of this family. We've chosen a bride from the Rothschild estate. Arthur Rothschild owes us $5 million. He's agreed to give us his most prized possession to clear the debt." Dominic didn't flinch. He opened the folder, fully expecting a spoiled, vapid socialite. Instead, a grainy photograph stared back at him. It wasn't a daughter. It was a maid. Her name was Clara Jenkins. The biography attached was brief and brutally dismissive. She was 29, an orphan, and worked as a scullery maid for the Rothschilds. She was also, as Vincent so gleefully pointed out, undeniably fat. Not pleasantly plump, not thick in the right places, but heavily overweight, the result, though the file didn't care to mention it, of a severe, untreated thyroid condition and years of poverty. "A plus-size scrubbing girl," Vincent laughed, the sound echoing off the stone walls. "The boss of Chicago, walking down the aisle with a fat maid who cleans toilets for a bankrupt gambler. A perfect match." Dominic's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. He saw the play perfectly. If he refused, he lost his effort. If he accepted, he became a laughingstock, severely weakening his authority. But Dominic Castellano did not lose. He closed the folder. "Clear Rothschild's debt," Dominic said, his voice a graveyard whisper. "I'll marry her on Saturday." Across town, at the sprawling Rothschild estate, Clara Jenkins was on her hands and knees, scrubbing the marble floor of the grand foyer. Sweat beaded on her forehead, matting her mousy brown hair. Her knees ached, and her breath came in shallow pants. At over 250 pounds, the physical labor took a heavy toll on her body, but she had no choice. She had no family, no money, and nowhere else to go. "Mr. Spot, Shamu," hissed Beatrice Rothschild, Arthur's youngest daughter, deliberately knocking over a vase of murky flower water right where Clara had just dried. Clara bit her tongue, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She grabbed her heavy, soaked rag and began again. She was used to being invisible, and when she wasn't invisible, she was a target. People looked at her and saw only her weight. They didn't see the sharp mind trapped beneath the anxiety, or the heart that still broke every night for a boy she had lost 15 years ago in a horrific foster home fire. A boy named Nico. The heavy oak doors of the foyer slammed open, shattering the quiet of the afternoon. Clara scrambled backward, clutching her bucket as half a dozen men in dark suits stormed in. The air in the room instantly dropped 10 degrees. At the center of the phalanx was a man who looked like violence, wrapped in velvet. Dominic Castellano. Arthur Rothschild came scurrying down the stairs, trembling visibly. "Mr. Castellano, I didn't expect you." "Save it, Arthur." Dominic cut him off, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that sent an inexplicable shiver down Clara's spine. "Where is she?" Arthur swallowed hard and pointed a shaking finger at the floor. Right there." Dominic slowly turned his gaze downward. Clara froze, her hands dripping with dirty water. She looked up, her wide, hazel eyes locking onto his piercing ice-blue ones. For a fraction of a second, the world stopped spinning. Dominic stared at the heavy-set woman in the stained, oversized apron. Her face was round, her chin soft, her body taking up space in a way that clearly made her deeply uncomfortable. She was nothing like the women in his world. Yet as he looked into her terrified, wide hazel eyes, a strange, violent jolt struck his chest. A phantom memory of smoke and soft hands. He suppressed it instantly. Clara, however, felt her breath catch in her throat. The sharp jawline, the cruel mouth, the ice-blue eyes. It couldn't be. The boy from the fire, her Nico, was dead. He had to be. This was a monster, a mob boss. But the tiny crescent-shaped scar just above his left eyebrow screamed a truth her mind couldn't process. "Get up!" Dominic ordered, his tone devoid of any warmth. Clara struggled to her feet, her legs shaking, her damp uniform clinging to her thick frame. "You're coming with me," Dominic stated, turning on his heel. "We're getting married on Saturday." The wedding was the social event of the season, but for all the wrong reasons. The Grand Cathedral in downtown Chicago was packed with the city's criminal elite, politicians, and corrupted socialites. They hadn't come to witness a union of love. They had come to watch the circus. Clara stood in the vestibule, clutching a bouquet of white roses so tightly the thorns bit through her lace gloves. The dress the syndicate had provided was an absolute disaster. It was expensive, covered in seed pearls, but the designers had been given only 3 days to fit a woman whose measurements disgusted them. The bodice pinched her ribs painfully, and the heavy satin skirt made her look even larger than she was. She felt like a parade float. When the doors opened, the silence that fell over the cathedral was deafening. As Clara walked down the aisle, the whispers started. "Look at the size of her. Vincent really did it. He made the boss marry a pig. She's sweating. How revolting." Tears pricked the corners of Clara's eyes, her cheeks flushing a deep, mottled red. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, terrified of the mocking faces. But when she reached the altar, she was forced to look up. Dominic stood there, looking like a dark gold in a bespoke tuxedo. His face was an impenetrable mask of stone. He heard the whispers. He saw the sneers. And while he felt no affection for the trembling fat woman standing before him, she was now wearing the Castellano name. She belonged to him. Dominic slowly turned his head, letting his icy gaze sweep over the front pews where Uncle Vincent and his cronies sat smirking. Dominic's eyes narrowed, a silent, terrifying promise of bloodshed. The whispering died instantly. The silence that followed was no longer mocking. It was fearful. He turned back to Clara and held out his hand. He didn't smile, but his grip was surprisingly gentle as he took her trembling, calloused hand in his. "Breathe," he muttered, so low only she could hear. They recited the vows mechanically. When the priest told him to kiss the bride, Dominic leaned down and pressed a stiff, formal kiss to her cheek. It was a transaction, a contract signed in front of God and the Mafia. That night, Clara was escorted to Dominic's sprawling, fortress-like estate on the edge of Lake Michigan. The housekeeper led her to a massive suite in the East Wing. Dominic's rooms were in the West Wing. The physical distance matched the emotional one. For the first 2 weeks, they lived like ghosts in the same house. Dominic was dealing with the fallout of his marriage, brutally cracking down on insubordination within his ranks. Clara, terrified and overwhelmed, reverted to the only thing she knew how to do: work. She couldn't sit still in the lap of luxury. Despite the protests of the estate staff, she began taking over the kitchen. One stormy Tuesday night, Dominic returned to the estate at 2 a.m. He looked battered. A rival faction had ambushed a shipment, and though Dominic had walked away the victor, he hadn't walked away unscathed. A deep gash ran along his forearm, and a severe, blinding migraine throbbed behind his eyes. He stumbled into the dimly lit kitchen to pour himself a glass of whiskey, only to freeze. Clara was there. She was wearing a simple, oversized cotton nightgown, her thick hair tied up in a messy bun. She was standing by the stove, humming a low, melancholic tune. Dominic's breath hitched. The tune. It was a Sicilian lullaby. His mother used to sing it, but he had only ever taught it to one person, a little girl named Claire, in the damp, freezing basement of the St. Jude's foster home. Clara turned around, startled, dropping a wooden spoon. "Mr. Castellano, Dominic, I mean. You're bleeding!" She didn't hesitate. Forgetting her fear, she rushed toward him, her bare feet padding softly against the hardwood. She grabbed a clean dishcloth and pressed it firmly against his bleeding forearm. "I'm fine," he snapped, trying to pull away, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "You're not fine. You're bleeding through your suit," she scolded, her voice losing its timid edge for a fraction of a second. She guided him to a heavy wooden island stool. "Sit. Let me clean this." Dominic, too exhausted to fight, sat. He watched her intently as she fetched a first aid kit from the pantry. She moved with a surprising grace for her size, her hands steady and gentle as she peeled away the ruined fabric of his sleeve. "You have a migraine," Clara observed softly, noting the way he kept his eyes half closed against the kitchen lights. "How do you know?" he grunted. "The way you're holding your jaw. You're clenching your teeth. Wait here." After wrapping his arm expertly, she moved to the stove. She pulled out a small mortar and pestle, tossing in dried chamomile flowers and fresh mint leaves. She crushed them together, the sharp, earthy scent filling the air, before steeping it in boiling water. Dominic's heart slammed against his ribs. The scent, the exact mixture. 15 years ago, after a severe beating from a foster father, a 12-year-old Dominic had suffered agonizing migraines. A 10-year-old girl named Claire had stolen chamomile from the kitchen and wild mint from the garden, crushing them together to soothe his pain. Clara brought the steaming mug to him. "Drink this, it helps." Dominic didn't look at the mug. He stared at her hand. There, on the inside of her plump wrist, obscured by years of weight gain but undeniably present, was a tiny, jagged burn scar. The scar she had gotten when she pulled him out of the flaming wreckage of St. Jude's before they were separated by the paramedics. Dominic's hand shot out. He didn't grab the mug. He seized her wrist, his grip like a steel vice. Clara gasped, dropping the mug. It shattered on the floor, hot tea splashing against her bare ankles. "Dominic, you're hurting me." He ignored her plea, standing up slowly, towering over her. His ice-blue eyes were wild, searching her round, frightened face, stripping away the heavy cheeks, the double chin, the years of pain and transformation. He looked past the fat maid they had forced him to marry, staring directly into the hazel eyes of his past. "Where did you learn to make that tea?" he demanded, his voice a dangerous, trembling growl. "And who gave you this scar?" Clara's pulse roared in her ears, deafening and frantic. She stared at the man gripping her wrist, the monstrous boss of Chicago, and the terrifying truth finally clicked into place. The fierce, protective anger in his eyes wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the world that had hurt her. The crescent scar. The deep, rumbling voice that had always felt so agonizingly familiar. "Nico," she whispered, the name tearing from her throat like a prayer she had been forbidden to speak for 15 years. Dominic's icy facade shattered. The ruthless Mafia Don vanished, leaving behind the desperate 12-year-old boy who had lost his only friend in a raging inferno. He dropped to his knees right there on the kitchen floor, wrapping his arms around her thick waist and burying his face in the soft cotton of her nightgown. His massive shoulders shook. "I looked for you," Dominic choked out, his voice hoarse with unshed tears and years of repressed agony. "For 10 years I tore this city apart looking for Claire. The state records said you died in the ambulance. They told me you were gone." Clara dropped to her knees beside him, her trembling hands coming up to cradle his face. "My foster parents. They changed my last name to Jenkins when they moved me to the state facility to avoid the hospital bills. I thought you burned in the basement, Nico. I thought I failed. You saved my life," he whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. "You saved me then, and they handed you right back to me." That night, the tectonic plates of the Chicago underworld shifted, even if the syndicate didn't know it yet. Dominic did not return to the West Wing. He carried Clara to his master suite, gently laying her down not as a pawn, but as his wife. They spent the hours until dawn trading the horrors of their pasts. Clara spoke of her untreated thyroid condition, the poverty that forced her into a body that felt like a prison of fatigue, and the relentless cruelty of the Rothschilds. Dominic listened, his blood running cold with a lethal, calculating rage. The next morning, the dynamic in the Castellano estate drastically changed. Dominic summoned his most trusted men, a tight inner circle loyal only to him, completely separate from Uncle Vincent's counsel. He appointed his right-hand enforcer, a brutal but fiercely loyal man named Matteo Russo, as Clara's personal shadow. Then, Dominic brought the outside world in. He flew in private endocrinologists to finally treat Clara's medical conditions, providing the care she had been denied her entire life. But he didn't ask her to change her body. He asked the world to change its perspective. He summoned Madame Genevieve, the most exclusive cutthroat couturier in Chicago, right to the estate. "They dressed you in a joke," Dominic told Clara, standing behind her as she looked nervously into a full-length gilded mirror. He wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "They wanted to humiliate me by highlighting your weight with cheap fabrics and terrible tailoring. They think a woman's worth is measured by a sample size. We are going to show them what a Castellano queen looks like." Over the next month, Clara transformed. She didn't lose 50 pounds magically, but the swelling in her face reduced as her thyroid was treated. More importantly, the suffocating cloak of anxiety lifted. Under Dominic's fierce adoration, she began to walk with her head held high. Her curves, previously hidden under stained aprons, were now draped in custom-tailored emerald silks and deep sapphire velvets that commanded attention. However, outside the fortified walls of the estate, Uncle Vincent was growing impatient. His plan to weaken Dominic was backfiring. Dominic wasn't hiding his fat bride. Rumors were swirling that the boss was fiercely devoted to her. Vincent needed to strike before Dominic's absolute authority was completely solidified. Vincent orchestrated a meeting with Arthur Rothschild. "Your daughter, Beatrice, still works the social circles," Vincent rasped, sliding a thick stack of bills across a speakeasy table. "The Castellano Centennial Gala is next week at the Palmer House Hilton. Dominic will bring the pig. I want Beatrice to cause a distraction. While Dominic is dealing with the embarrassment, my men will move in. We end his reign, and I take the seat." Arthur, sweating and desperate, nodded greedily. He had no idea he was signing his own death warrant. What neither Vincent nor Arthur knew was that Clara wasn't just surviving anymore. She was listening. Years of being an invisible plus-size maid had taught her how to blend into the background, how to read lips, and how to understand the dangerous undercurrents of the wealthy and corrupt. The grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton was drenched in gold leaf and dripping with crystal chandeliers. The entire Chicago syndicate was present, a sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer gowns covering a pit of vipers. When the massive double doors swung open, the murmurs died instantly. Dominic Castellano entered, radiating lethal authority. But all eyes were drawn to the woman on his arm. Clara took their breath away. She was not a waif, and she was not hiding. She wore a custom off-the-shoulder gown of rich blood-red velvet that hugged her generous curves perfectly, corset-laced at the back to accentuate her waist and flow elegantly to the floor. A breathtaking diamond collar, a Castellano family heirloom long thought lost, rested against her collarbones. Her mousy hair had been transformed into cascading, glossy chestnut waves. She looked majestic, powerful, and utterly untouchable. Uncle Vincent's jaw tightened so hard, his teeth nearly cracked. He signaled to Beatrice Rothschild across the room. Beatrice, wearing a plunging silver dress, sneered. She grabbed a tray of red wine from a passing waiter and marched directly toward Clara. "Oops!" Beatrice loudly mocked, preparing to hurl the dark liquid over Clara's pristine red velvet gown to publicly humiliate her. But Clara wasn't the terrified scullery maid anymore. As Beatrice tripped forward to throw the wine, Clara smoothly stepped aside, hooking her velvet-draped foot around Beatrice's ankle. Beatrice shrieked, crashing into a towering champagne pyramid. Glass shattered everywhere, drenching Beatrice in sticky alcohol. The room gasped. Clara looked down at her former tormentor, her hazel eyes completely devoid of pity. "Mr. Spot, Beatrice," Clara said coldly, her voice carrying through the silent ballroom. Dominic smirked, a dark, dangerous thrill shooting through him. But the distraction had been triggered. Out of the corner of her eye, Clara saw it. 3 waiters near the service doors weren't looking at the commotion. Their hands were slipping beneath their serving jackets. They were looking at Dominic. Instincts forged in a burning basement 15 years ago took over. "Nico, the doors!" Clara screamed, throwing her heavy body directly against Dominic, tackling him behind a massive marble pillar, just as the deafening roar of automatic gunfire erupted. Chaos swallowed the ballroom. Guests screamed and hit the floor. The 3 disguised hitmen unloaded their clips toward the pillar, shattering the marble and tearing up the lavish carpets. Dominic shielded Clara with his body, drawing his own weapon. Matteo Russo and Dominic's loyalists immediately returned fire, turning the opulent gala into a war zone. The acoustics of the ballroom amplified the terrifying thunder of the shootout. Two of the assassins dropped instantly, their blood staining the imported rugs. The third, desperate, made a run for the kitchens. Dominic stood up, his eyes locking onto the man sitting frozen at the VIP table, who hadn't even attempted to take cover. Uncle Vincent. The gunfire ceased, leaving only the sound of whimpering guests and ringing ears. Dominic walked slowly across the devastated ballroom, his gun hanging loosely at his side. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He reached Vincent's table. "You invoked the family laws, Vincent," Dominic said softly, the silence of his voice more terrifying than the gunshots. "You told me to take a wife to prove I was fit to lead. You thought you gave me a weakness." Dominic gestured back to Clara. She had stepped out from behind the pillar. Her red dress was dusted with plaster, but she stood tall, uninjured, her eyes blazing with an inner fire that demanded absolute respect. She wasn't trembling. She was a survivor. "You didn't give me a weakness, Uncle," Dominic whispered, raising his weapon and pressing the barrel directly against Vincent's forehead. "You gave me back my soul, and you gave the Castellano family its true queen." Dominic pulled the trigger. The deafening crack echoed through the ballroom, signaling the absolute end of the old regime. Vincent slumped forward onto the table. Dominic turned around, ignoring the carnage, and walked back to Clara. He holstered his weapon, reaching out to gently wipe a streak of plaster from her soft cheek. In front of the remaining council members, the corrupt politicians, and the trembling socialites, Dominic knelt on one knee before his plus-size bride. He took her hand and pressed a reverent kiss to her knuckles, sealing his absolute devotion. The message was clear. The Castellano Syndicate had a new era. It would be ruled by Dominic's iron fist and guided by Clara's unshakable heart. The woman they had chosen as a joke had become their absolute ruler. The Maid was dead. Long live the Queen. If you loved this story of vengeance, loyalty, and a fiercely powerful plus-size queen reclaiming her throne, give this video a thumbs up. What did you think of Clara's incredible transformation and Dominic's brutal devotion? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We love reading them. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more dramatic, heart-stopping romance stories. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.